Welcome in the latest episode of that SEC podcast brought to you by Twisted Tea and MyBookie. I'm your host, Michael Braden. Go by SEC Mike on Twitter. No cousin Shane, but you know why. That's right. It's a Steven Lassan Tuesday on the show. Deep dive with Steven. Previewed the upcoming games, talked about the games that were, but also kind of went all around the SEC with Steven. Had a number of conversations that just because this weekend's slate not the greatest, so I thought it was would be a good time to kind of go around the league. But we do got one hell of a slate coming up, week 10 week. So the SEC just announced those kickoff times. We're going to get to that in a minute. But before we do, arguably the biggest storyline, Sam Pittman and firing Dan Enos. A lot of turmoil, I think, is a right word to use there in Fayetteville. And this stat jumped out to me. This comes courtesy of ESPN college football analyst Tom Luganbill. Arkansas has had 21 one-possession games under Sam Pittman. The Razorbacks are 5-16 in those 21 games. And so I mean, you could spin that any way you want. They're close, but, coaching dictates, these one-score games, certainly. So not getting it done, and that's why Dan Enos is out. Kenny Guyton, the receivers coach, he's going to be the new offensive coordinator, play caller, and quarterbacks coach with KJ Jefferson there. So, normally we don't go to the press conferences this early in the week, but Sam Pittman, he had a lot to say. Let's start with his decision to fire Dan Enos and kind of what all went into that on Sunday as the drastic measures being taken here following just a terribly disappointing streak here for the Razorbacks.
Coach, why do you think it didn't work? You talked about volume here just now, but what else played into it just not being a fit?
I think a lot of coaching has to do with enthusiasm, spirit, wanting to run through a wall for different people, and we just really never had that on the offensive side of the ball. If you look at it defensively, there's a lot of that there. I think you can get guys to play better than maybe even what their talents are if they believe in you. And to be honest with you, until this season, that has been I think, a positive about me, that, guys seem to want to play and those things of that nature. And they've got it going on defense, so I know it's possible to do. We have a lot of similar players that we've had in the past. It just never clicked, and it really never did. And so this is not a move for any other reason than it just wasn't working. And it's not a move to can the season. We've got a really good defense. If our offense can go out and function well, we still have games that we can win, and we need to. And so I can't really put a finger on it, except it was just rough. Our kids weren't as motivated, and that can go on me as well. Our kids weren't as motivated to play as what I have seen in the past. And I mean, you could tell the way we took the field on Saturday that it was like, and I can remember being on the headset going, what are we doing? I mean, it's almost like a bum, 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 as we're going out there. And we were in the game the entire game. It just didn't feel like it. And and I'll give Mississippi State had a great game plan and all that, but we didn't adjust. And so that would be the only thing. We've lost our spirit, and there's a lot to be said about that.
With Coach.
And one other thing I thought was pretty interesting from this press conference, I'm kind of reading between the lines here, but a lot of people want to see offensive line coach Cody Kennedy gone as well. Sam Pittman has made it abundantly clear he thinks Cody Kennedy is a good offensive line coach. That certainly remains to be seen, but, and this is just me speculating, I don't have any inside knowledge here, but I think one of them had to go. Dan Enos or Cody Kennedy. And I think Sam Pittman chose his guy. And he may, maybe Dan Enos was the problem. I have no idea. Could be both of them for all I know. But Pittman had some other interesting comments. He's going to leave the defense alone. Defense is fine. It's the offense got to obviously turn it up a notch. Listen to what Sam Pittman had to say here, and I'll give you my thoughts on it.
I was just going to say, Coach, sort of building off of that, you've mentioned several times being involved in the meetings with Kenny. How much are you looking to have a hand in the game plan, or are you just sort of there supervising what he's doing?
All of it. I mean, it's my butt on the line, It's all of us, I don't worry so much about losing my job. I worry so much about losing the building's job. We got buyouts and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to buy out. I want to win. And so I'm not saying I'm the know-all answer guy, but I damn sure need to get involved more, and that's what I'm going to do.
So the reason I really wanted to play that clip, because it says to me that Sam Pittman says, hey, where's he going to help this team? He's going to help by coaching the offensive line. Now, he's not saying that. I don't know that for a fact. But if he's getting so intimately involved in the offense, hell, he ain't going to be coaching receivers or quarterbacks or anything like that, or even the running backs. It's going to be that offensive line. So the fact that he kept Cody Kennedy, the fact that he's saying he's going to get more involved, be very interested to see what this offensive line does for the rest of the season. And, I mean, if it was an easy fix, I think they would have already done it. So I'm not anticipating it's just going to be an immediate turnaround, but they do got 2 weeks to prep for this. Florida, tough game at Florida is their next ball game. They're off this weekend. But one other thing, I just appreciate the fact that Sam's putting this on him. He doesn't give a damn about the buyout. He wants to win. He's at least saying the right things, unlike many of these other SEC coaches that seem to be clueless when it comes to taking responsibility.
So to get that, you got to coach better. You got to get some more players and things. But I'm real confident that we can get it back to what is respectable plus for the state of Arkansas. And to be honest with you, that's really all I'm worried about. I'm not worried about my job. I'm worried about the damn state of Arkansas. And having them proud of our football team. And hell, I'm not right now, and I know they ain't, and I get it. But I'm the only one that can change it. So we're going to work like hell to get that done.
You talked about competition.
Week 10 kickoffs. Wanted to get to that real quick before we get to our long conversation here with Stephen Lassan. But the November 4th Week 10 match, this is going to be quite the slate. And obviously this is not this weekend. It's going to be the following weekend of SEC action. But we got 8 games to digest on November 4th, starting with Texas A&M at Ole Miss, noon Eastern on ESPN. That's a hell of a matchup there. A&M can't get over Lane Kiffin. This is going to be an opportunity for Jimbo to get a big win, kind of swing momentum back his way, start winning some of those fans back over. Also, noon Eastern, 11 Central, Arkansas at Florida on ESPN2. So 2 great matchups here to start things off on the November 4th weekend in the SEC. But there's 2 other games, too. Jacksonville State at South Carolina, noon Eastern on ESPNU. So that South Carolina desperately going to need a win. And if you don't know, Jacksonville State, their head coach is Rich Rodriguez. So could be an interesting matchup. And UConn at Tennessee, that's the final nooner. 4 nooners on November 4th. UConn at Tennessee, noon Eastern on the SEC Network. Doubleheader for CBS, starting with 2 epic games. Cannot wait for these. Missouri at Georgia, 3:30 Eastern, 2:30 Central on CBS. That'll be the first one of the doubleheader. Auburn at Vanderbilt, 4 o'clock Eastern on SEC Network. Kentucky at Mississippi State, 7:30 Eastern, 6:30 Central, SEC Network. This is a nice little annual rivalry that has gone back and forth over the years. And then the final game, the doubleheader here for the CBS, no surprise, LSU at Alabama, 7:45 Eastern, 6:45 Central. What a slate of games we have coming our way in the SEC November 4th. Cannot wait for these matchups. And I can't wait to kick it over here to our buddy Stephen Lassan. Let's kick it over to this great conversation. All right, hey, it's Tuesday, so you know what that means. It's a Stephen Lassan Tuesday, our good buddy over there at Athlon Sports, senior editor. How's it going, Stephen?
Hey, Mike, it's going great. I appreciate you having me on each week. I was curious what fan base is the angriest in the SEC as we get ready to go into week 9. Hard to believe we're already there.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you are specifically referencing, Stephen. If you want to talk officiating, Tennessee, hands down, they're the most pissed at the moment. I would throw South Carolina, Arkansas. Who else we got that's burning stuff down? Auburn, we're firing Hugh Freeze already. It is, it's upset city in the SEC. I'll tell you that. And we ain't even close to being done with the season.
That's like half the SEC. Let me check the Alabama message boards to read up on Tommy Rees's performance review at the midpoint of the season. I don't know, Mississippi State's offense. Hey, it's week 9. It's hard to believe we're already at that point. But we're coming down the home stretch, which I think the month of November in the SEC is going to be awesome because there's just not only it's the end of season rivalry games, which I don't want to wish to be here already, but you also have so many high profile matchups coming up. We've got some coaching stuff that's still out there. So man, the month of November, it's going to be pretty awesome around this conference.
Yeah, we've had our first coordinator fired in the SEC, so we'll get into that. I got a fun topic that I've asked Stephen to prepare for us on this show. We're going to talk some of these teams that are fighting for their bowl lives, and really games that will decide the SEC race. I've asked Stephen to kind of break those down before we get finally into some Week 9 previews. But before we get into all that, Stephen, thoughts on the weekend that was in the SEC, and I guess we got to start with Alabama and their decaying dynasty staying alive for one more week here, beating Tennessee. Thoughts on, one half of elite football from Tennessee and an even more elite half of football by Alabama in the half that really mattered.
I hate to use the cliche, a tale of two halves. It really was, though. And I certainly think early on in that game, Tennessee had some missed opportunities. You talk about just instead of kicking field goals, you score touchdowns, the pass that goes through the receiver's hand. And maybe if Tennessee's up 21 to nothing at halftime, we're talking about a different game at that point. I think for Alabama, I think you have to give them a lot of credit this year for the, I don't know if mental resolve, the Michael Myers of the SEC, that no matter what you do to them, they just do not seem to stop. They just keep punching back every week. So I think while this Alabama team is flawed, I think they're closer to 10 this year in the rankings. We'll see what happens when they play LSU in a few weeks. But I think week in and week out, this team just keeps finding ways to win. I think they've gotten better since the start of the season, but the same flaws on this team, the offensive line, I think you can throw the ball in the secondary. We'll see if that comes back to haunt them when they play LSU in a few weeks. But really, tale of two halves, missed opportunities for Tennessee and for Alabama. I think it's just about that mental resolve of just continuing to find ways to win.
Yeah, and we were talking off air. Paul Saban, went over there to the student section, ran over there. I think he was saying goodbye to them, Stephen, because he knew, and this is one of the final home games of his career. Am I going too far? What's your thoughts on that?
I don't think that's crazy at all. I mean, I'm all into the conspiracy theories. I mean, we live for this coaching stuff to get really interesting in the month of November, and you see little things like that make you wonder what's going on. I was, just looking at their schedule. They get LSU, of course, and UT Chattanooga. So I'm going to circle November 18th to see if that same victory lap is there and how extensive it is. But I think, certainly, I think that kind of one of the themes for me as we go into November is the coaching and kind of questions around the SEC, because nationally, now I think there are some programs. I mean, Jim Harbaugh might be an NFL head coach by January. We're at that point of Nick Saban's tenure where at any point it wouldn't surprise me if he retired. What does A&M do? There are some other programs. So we only have 2 jobs right now that are open, and there's bound to be some more turnover. So I think to your point, I am reading everything into these things and going to be believing every little sign and conspiracy theory until we actually get to that end of season and Nick Saban says he's back in 2024.
So reading in between the lines, sounds like Steven is reporting Nick Saban back to Michigan State, where it all started at the big power conference level.
Well, West Virginia's head coach is also on the hot seat. So get Nick Saban back to West Virginia to finish.
That's Jimbo's job. Jimbo's going to be taking it here in a couple. He's said it publicly. But let me ask you about.
We're all into throwbacks like helmets and jerseys and logos, and I know Mississippi State, Arkansas was a nice tribute to the Jefferson Pilot era of SEC football. I mean, why not throw it back with the coaches too? Nick Saban at Michigan State, Jimbo to West Virginia.
Well, we'll talk about that travesty of a football game in just a second. But I did want to ask you about Tennessee. Joe Milton, I thought, at least for a half, I mean, that was the best game I think he'd played all season. They didn't finish the deal, so I don't really know that you take too much from that. But anything that you saw from Joe Milton and Tennessee in that first half that gives you confidence that because upcoming, Stephen, they got Kentucky on the road, Missouri on the road, Georgia at home. Anything that you saw, and maybe let's throw that Georgia game out for now, because Georgia's, hell, until they actually lose a game, I don't know that anyone can beat them. But at Missouri, at Kentucky, anything you saw from Joe Milton in Tennessee, at least for a half, that gives you confidence that that maybe they can get things right on the road?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you're a Tennessee fan, you have to at least be encouraged that Joe Milton in the passing game for a half went on the road to Tuscaloosa and played pretty well. Now, obviously, there were some mistakes and missed passes from Milton, and some receivers could certainly step up. But early in that game, I was thinking, man, this is a totally different Joe Milton. Like, the receivers that have been inconsistent this season were making plays. Like, it was a totally different Tennessee offense. So I think the optimism, if I'm a Tennessee fan, is can you recapture what you saw in the first half against, Kentucky, Missouri, and Georgia? And I think there are some things you can build upon. Now, the road slate is tough. There's no doubt about it. And you get Georgia, arguably one of the nation's best defenses. But if you were looking for progress, I think you can say that there was some progress in the first half to make this Tennessee team more complete offensively, because we know they can run the ball and they're playing pretty good defense right now. So I think if I was a Tennessee fan, I would be more optimistic about Milton after that first half. Granted, you got to see 60 minutes, but the 30 was a step in the right direction.
Well, speaking of progress, Stephen, that's what they're doing at Missouri. 7-1, best start since they entered the SEC, and they won the East that year back in, 2013. But Missouri just put a whooping on South Carolina at home, 34-12, in their most complete game, just completely dominated the Gamecocks. And I guess we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute here, but Missouri, Georgia looming, that's Missouri's next game. They get 2 weeks to prepare for it. What's your thoughts on Missouri and what they're building? And I have to imagine, Stephen, that, not that you'd be outright picking them to win in Athens, but I have to imagine, as we're recording this October 23rd, your confidence that they could do it has got to be significantly higher now than it was at the start of the season.
100%. So if you would have asked me at the beginning of the season, I probably would have said zero chance to go into Georgia and win. Granted, they played Georgia really well last year in Columbia, had them on the edge of an upset. So we shouldn't totally dismiss Missouri going down to Athens and playing well. But I think what they've done this year, when we get to the actual games, gives you some confidence that, hey, maybe it will be a game in Athens in 2 weeks. And I love the fact that if you're Missouri, they've been finding, I wouldn't say necessarily different ways to win, but, Cody Schrader had a huge game on Saturday, over 100, I think over 150 rushing yards. They got 6 sacks against Spencer Rattler. The passing game the last was a couple of weeks has not been as explosive, maybe as we saw at times, but they just keep finding different ways to win. And they've now played 8 games, hitting the off week with 2 weeks to prepare for Georgia. I mean, if you're Missouri, this is like, I don't want to say like a dream season, because you're just a couple plays away from being 8-0 and beating LSU. But I mean, to be sitting here at 7-1 with a chance to play for the SEC East in 2 weeks, that's a great season so far from Missouri.
Yeah, and now on the flip side, not a great season for the Gamecocks. Things are, I mean, to put it mildly, in neutral, but a backslide. Let's call it what it is. Thoughts on what they're doing there in Columbia, because the defense is a travesty. The offense outside of Spencer Rattler and Leggett is essentially just as poor. And this is year 3. You think we're taking steps forward, yet we're taking steps back. I guess my real question, Stephen, is how concerned are you that this can get turned around? And it's probably not going to get turned around this season, but just projecting ahead, Shane Beamer, do you have confidence in him to turn this ship around?
Yeah, right now I do, because he's been Mr. November the last 2 years. And so I still think with the 4 games they have at home to finish the year, they have a chance to make a run and potentially get bowl eligible. If you ask me at this point, the odds probably dwindled a little bit watching them against Missouri. I think they're probably going to end up 5-7. But I think the biggest problem for this team is, they lost Juice Wells. Leggett got hurt. The offensive line, they lost Jalen Nichols in the preseason. They've been banged up, starting freshmen. You look on the defensive side, you lose a couple corners that were outstanding from last year. The defense kind of falls apart in the back end. I think the line of scrimmage is kind of where I'm looking to see where this team can go in the offseason. Like, can they fortify the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball going forward? Because that's been a real weakness this season. And of course, I think as we start to hit the final stretch of the season, I think you start thinking ahead to next year, and Spencer Rattler is going to be throwing passes in the NFL. So it is going to be, I think, important for this team to finish on a high note as we go into next year because of some of the questions. And I think it would not surprise me at all to see South Carolina probably pretty active in the portal as they look to fill some of these needs.
Mm-hmm. How about Ole Miss going on the road, beating Auburn? Sloppy, ugly game. A win's a win, particularly on the road. They're not easy to come by in this conference. Did you come away impressed by Ole Miss, or because I have no clue what to make of them, Stephen? It was tied up in the fourth quarter, I believe, going into the fourth quarter. Now they dominated the final stanza, and that's all that really matters. But Auburn is just pathetic on offense. So I don't really know what to take away from this result.
You might think I'm crazy for saying this, but I think that's actually a pretty good win for Ole Miss. Hear me out. I think, first of all, weird things happen at Auburn, night games against SEC opponents, or weird things just happen at Auburn to favorites. And the fact that series had been so one-sided in favor of Auburn, I think for Ole Miss to go in there, kind of not play its best game and still find a way to win. It's hard to win games, like you said, in this conference. So I think it says something that Ole Miss didn't play its best game, and they still found a way to win at a spot that they haven't had a lot of success recently. Now, the flip side of that is you could say if they just don't turn the ball over, if they finish drives, we're talking about a completely one-sided score, and it's not even close. there's meat on the bone there for Ole Miss to play better. But I think if you can, in a spot where I had worries about maybe Auburn pulling off the upset, to go in there and to find a way to win when you played maybe your C-level game, I think that's a good win for Ole Miss. But feel free to call me crazy on that one.
Well, all right. Well, how about the other side then of Auburn? Does that mean you're impressed with Auburn? Because I don't know what in the world they're doing on the offensive side of the ball. I don't know if you caught it from the broadcast, but they said, when Robbie Ashford's in the game, Hugh Freeze calling the plays. When Peyton Thorne's in the game, Philip Montgomery's calling. Like this is like high school stuff. Like, and they're not getting any better on the offense. They seem to be getting worse under this coaching staff, and maybe it's fair to say they don't have a full deck. To put it kindly, of the players they have to work with. But hell, we've seen Josh Heupel, we've seen Shane Beamer, we've seen Brian Kelly. We've seen the coaches kind of come in with a similar situation, and it's not this bad.
I think on Auburn's offense, I think two things are true here. I'm surprised that they have struggled as much as they have this year. I thought with the portal acquisitions all across the board that they would just be better this year. They wouldn't be at the top of the SEC, but they'd be better than last year. And, you go look statistically from this year compared to last year, it's not much better, and it might be worse in some areas. It's hard because, Peyton Thorne, when he was at Michigan State, was pretty solid, especially when they were able to give him a good running game. And, Jarquez Hunter had a great game on Saturday night. And I think maybe that's one of the keys here for Auburn is finding more ways to get Hunter more involved, more touches going forward. But the whole operation offensively, whether it's offensive line, receiving core has underachieved, even some of the transfer additions they brought in, the 2 quarterback system. It feels like, if you listen to Hugh Freeze, that they have more confidence in Peyton Thorne executing the offense. And, you saw, I think, some criticism of the way Robbie Ashford handled one of the early running plays. I think he was supposed to give it, and he didn't. And so I think there's a lot about this offense right now that just is not adding up to me. I think if Auburn, a lot of Auburn fans frustrated with Philip Montgomery, but to me, this is a collective effort. Like Hugh Freeze has been, head coach calling plays before. Montgomery's been a successful offensive coordinator. I think some of it's probably personnel and scheme not quite matching up, and some of this it's also a lesson too, I think, in this era of college football where you can bring in a ton of players to the portal. Sometimes when you try to make it all work in one offseason, it just doesn't. So I think I'm surprised at where this is at, and you look at their schedule. They play Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, and New Mexico State, so it might get a little bit better. I don't think it's going to get much better overall this season, though. I think they kind of have what they have the rest of the year.
Well, let's hope that's not the case with these. I guess I didn't realize, Stephen, that the Big Ten has expanded into the SEC, but that apparently is the case with Mississippi State and Arkansas, 7-3. Just a god-awful game. I watched the highlights.
Did you fall asleep?
I mean, it's not... It's not fair to even call them highlights. I mean, it's like clips from the game that are just awful. But, what do you make of this travesty of a football game that we witnessed over the weekend? Mississippi State beating Arkansas 7-3. And I've heard Mississippi State fans, Stephen, say, you ain't giving us enough credit. You deserve no credit for that. You had one drive, and, okay, credit for a drive, I guess. But, I mean, I would not claim that game if I was a fan of either one of these.
Yeah, I mean, 2.9 yards per play for Arkansas, 405 total yards between the two teams. I mean, that's a good day for Jaden Daniels when you go to 405 yards in a game, and these two teams are combining for 405 yards. I mean, I joked about it earlier. It set offensive football back like 15 years in the SEC. I mean, this is like 11 a.m. JP Sports, 3 days kicking the game off and fighting for bowl eligibility. That's what this was. But no, I think, first of all, it is a good win for Mississippi State because it moves them one step closer to bowl eligibility. And you look at their schedule, there are some opportunities, I think, for them to get to 6 wins. On the flip side, I understand where Mississippi State fans are going with the defense angle. It's hard to give a ton of credit to a defense when you see what Arkansas offensive line was doing on Saturday. KJ Jefferson was just basically under fire anytime he dropped back. I mentioned it, less than 3 yards per play. It's a good win for Mississippi State considering what the goal should be at this point. But on the flip side, it's just was a very, very awful, ugly offensive game in the SEC.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of glad that it sounds like you're already kind of eyeing bowls for a lot of these teams. So I wanted to ask you. I do want to ask you about Dan Enos here in just a second, but real quickly, Stephen, chances that the following teams, I got 5 here that I'm thinking in the SEC, out of 0 to 100, obviously zero being 0%, 0 to 100, what percentage do you give Auburn to make a bowl game as they sit here coming off of the loss to Ole Miss?
I'm going to say 75%. I think at 3 wins, if you give them a win over New Mexico State and Vanderbilt, that gets them to 5, and you ask them to beat Mississippi State or Arkansas, I think that's doable. It's certainly not going to be right. Right. As the SEC West might go down to that final week, regardless of what happens on November 4th with Alabama and LSU. So yeah, I think as ugly as it is offensively, there's enough winnable games there for Auburn to get to 6.
All right, how about same question, Arkansas, 0 to 100. What percentage chance do you give the Razorbacks to making a bowl game?
If you would have asked me last week, I probably would have said closer to 50-50. I think it's probably like 10% now. You look at their schedule, FIU on November 18th is by far the most winnable game, and they're going to be underdogs against Missouri and certainly at Florida. Auburn, I think, could be closer to a toss-up game. It's hard for me to think that they can run the table the rest of the way in those 4 games with the way they played and with some. We'll see what happens with the offense, but it's hard to believe that this team could just do a complete turnaround at this point.
Yeah, and you kind of hinted at this already, but same thing, Mississippi State, big win, took a step closer. What percentage chance do you give the Bulldogs?
I'm going to go about 75%, kind of the same thing as Auburn. I think sitting here at 4, they should beat Southern Miss before the Egg Bowl on November 18th. That gets them to 5. So they just need to pick off one of Auburn, Kentucky, Texas A&M, or Ole Miss. I think they can find one out of that stretch. If they can get everyone healthy, we joked about how the defense, I don't know how much credit, especially with the way Arkansas is playing, but if they can get better play out of the secondary to go with maybe the offense sort of stabilizing over this last stretch, I think they can get to 6.
Yeah. How about South Carolina?
Probably about 25%, a little bit higher, I think, than Arkansas because of those last 4 games at home. I think they'll beat Jacksonville State, and I think they'll beat Vanderbilt, which means it comes down to Kentucky and Clemson. Clemson looks more and more winnable as every week goes on. So maybe it's the Kentucky game that that their season comes down to, whether they finish 5-7 or 6-6. Joked about it earlier, but Shane Beamer has been very good down the stretch of the last 2 seasons. So if they can find just enough combined with home games, Spencer Rattler maybe getting hot down the stretch, it's not out of the question. It's just going to be tough, I think, to win the last 4 and get to 6.
All right, then the last one I wanted to ask you about, Stephen, the Fighting Jimbo Fishers and A&M. I mean, I'm kind of half kidding, but not really. Chances they make a bowl game, because you could, hell, if they lose on Saturday to South Carolina, I mean, I think the wheels completely fall off, and I don't think they make it. What percentage chance do you give A&M?
Do you think if Texas A&M loses on Saturday, they should politely escort Jimbo Fisher to a side room at Kyle Field and escort him off the premises after, just like they did with Brett Bielema at the end of, 2019?
Yeah.
I mean, they fired him right after the game. So
I mean, if he loses that game at home, to this team, put him out of his misery, pay him whatever he's due, send him packing, because maybe we can get interim Bobby Petrino here to turn this ship around.
Yeah. Interim Bobby Petrino, who does well enough to be the Arkansas offensive coordinator, would be like the ultimate SEC fan fiction that we could possibly conjure up here. I'll go with 99% here for Texas A&M. I'll leave the 1% door open because for our criticism of Jimbo Fisher. So I think A&M getting South Carolina, Mississippi State at home, plus Abilene Christian. I think they can definitely find 2 in there.
All right, so I said we talked Dan Enos, Stephen, what he last 8 games, I think, there at Arkansas. Just an abject failure. And before we get into this, what was your thoughts on Arkansas making that move? Any surprise? And just when you saw that come across your news feed there on Sunday, what was your reaction?
I actually think I think first of all, I think it's a good thing for Arkansas. It's clear it's not working. So try something and shake things up. I think, and this is going to sound a little weird, but I give Sam Pittman credit for actually making the move, because you see so many coaches sometimes who could just say, we're just going to keep going to the end of the season. We're going to evaluate after the season. It's execution. It's this or that. I give him credit for doing it, because it's costing Arkansas almost $3 million. And it's clear that something's not working. So try something different and don't waste any time. And so I give him credit for actually making the move and not waiting to the end of the season. You have 2 weeks to get ready for your next game. I don't know how much Kenny Guyton can really do in that short term. It's a tough ask considering the personnel, but someone new, a new voice leading the offense over the last 4 games, I think it's worth a shot for Arkansas. You have nothing to lose, because if Enos wasn't going to come back anyways, don't waste your time. Make the move and start over right now.
Yeah. Well, I asked you ahead of time, Stephen, to come up with a list of just the worst SEC coordinators that you can think of during your time. I got a list of my own, but I'm curious to see how many of these guys will be on your list. So just any that stand out, as long as you've been covering this, just who are the and I guess we got to put Enos on the list, even though he has accomplished some things in his time, but it's just been so pathetic. I mean, if you would have told me in the preseason, I hate to rehash all this, but if you would have told me, Stephen, that Arkansas defensive turnaround, leading the SEC in takeaways, I said, by God, we got us a hell of a team. Because I never even considered. I mean, I did think that KJ in a new system, that may not be as good as some people were hyping up, but never in a million years did I think the offense would be the thing that's holding Arkansas back, yet it clearly is. So who's on your list of some of the worst coordinators that you can recall in the SEC?
I got a long list of them. I will say one thing about some of these names is I sort of consider guys more like bad coordinator hires who were there for 1 year and that was it. Like if you were like, everybody gives Todd Grantham grief and Bill O'Brien. They have a little bit more of a track record. I would put them kind of in the middle that, they were okay, but certainly not one of the better ones. How about the most anonymous SEC offensive coordinator ever, David Ray, who was at Vanderbilt, who lost the offensive coordinator job at some point in the offseason or between game 1 and game 2 of Vanderbilt in Clark Lee's first year. I bring that up because it's strange to me that he was completely anonymous. And there's probably a reason why he lost his job early in the year. Brian Schottenheimer at Georgia, 22.9 points a game at Georgia. I think puzzling from the start. The results on the field definitely matched, I think, what we all kind of wondered going into the season.
Yeah, he was on my list for sure.
Yeah. How about another one? Rich Scangarello from the drop off from Liam Cohen to Rich Scangarello was massive. So he was easily one of the guys on here. Carl Durrell at Vanderbilt. He was Derek Mason's first offensive coordinator. Somehow his 12.8 points a game in SEC play was enough for Colorado to hire him later on as its head coach. So just think, Mike, you know what? We're close to Halloween. I want to be a fired head coach one day. That's my dream job. I just want to live the buyout life. So I got a few more here for you. Any of those stand out?
I had Rich Scangarello certainly on my list. I mean, the highlight of his time at Lexington was they figured out he looked like Steve Zahn, the actor, and they did a stupid skit with him. That's the only memorable thing, aside from some of the players publicly saying the offensive coordinator was holding them back. That's pretty rare to see, but that kind of was the highlight of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I enjoyed the little skit with Steve Zahn, though. That was good. How about LSU offensive coordinators after Joe Brady, like Jake Peets? That was a big step back. Also, Bo Pelini at LSU. Yeah. A disaster. Matt Canada, for those of us who might keep up with the Pittsburgh Steelers, a disaster in the NFL, a disaster at LSU. How about any offensive coordinator for the most part that Will Muschamp hired at Florida or South Carolina? Charlie Weiss, Brent Pease. I mean, we could go on. There were several of them.
Who was the guy? Do you remember he hired? I think he was his last Florida coordinator, and then when he got to South Carolina, he hired him again. And his famous quote was, "If I had hired this guy sooner, I'd still be at Florida." Do you remember that guy?
Kurt Roper.
Yeah, thank you. I was like, good. And then his ass was gone pretty quick from South Carolina too.
Don't let Will Muschamp hire your offensive coordinator. That's also, what about Steve Wilkes at Missouri? A guy came to a high pedigree from the NFL. He's been, pretty solid in the NFL. Came to Missouri and was just an abject disaster and got booted before the season was over. And I had to mention Peter Sermon at Mississippi State. He was a defensive coordinator for one season, gave up over 30 points a game. It seems he's been the defensive coordinator at Louisville, California, and Mississippi State, and bad defenses seem to follow him everywhere he goes. I'm not really sure why people keep hiring him as their defensive coordinator. And I had to mention, for our good sake, Marcus Satterfield.
I can't believe I left him off my list. I mean, what a legend that guy was.
Hey. Too many screens, man. Too many screens.
Well, speaking of South Carolina, I got, remember Lorenzo Ward, defensive coordinator under Spurrier. Now he lasted longer than a year, so maybe he doesn't deserve to be on here, but he was pretty awful. Derek Dooley, I put him on mine. Mizzou, he got Barry Odom fired. I know Barry Odom is still sore about that as Missouri's head coach.
Still one of the most random offensive coordinator hires. Derek Dooley is the Missouri.
I don't think Derek Dooley had ever called a play.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know why he was the hire. Another guy that's similar. I don't even know if you'll remember this guy, Stephen. Larry Scott. He was Tennessee's offensive coordinator in 2017. They didn't win a damn game in the SEC. That was puzzling from the beginning. Shout out. This guy's a legend at two schools, Tennessee and LSU, but he was a legend for the wrong reason at two others, A&M and Arkansas. I just clued you in. Do you know who I'm talking about? John Chambers.
Yeah.
He was the hire that was going to save A&M and Sumlin, and then he was just so awful for Chad Morris, so I had to throw him on here.
Do you remember when Chad Morris was hired? He said he was going to go out and get the best defensive coordinator, and there was the rumblings that it meant Brent Venables because Morris's ties to Clemson. It was John Chavis. So,
and then two Tennessee ones. This guy he got Philip Fulmer essentially fired, and he's actually turned into one hell of a head coach. You know who I'm talking about?
Hit me with it.
Dave Clawson, Wake Forest. He for whatever reason his scheme did not translate. The offensive lineman couldn't understand it. It was one of the worst offenses I ever seen. And then not long, I guess this was under Dooley. Dooley made a lot of bad choices, but Sal Sunseri as defensive coordinator was, he just ruined his reputation forever as a defensive coordinator under Tennessee. So those were the guys that stood out to me as just being just awful coordinators.
I don't know if this guy was awful as much as he didn't get the most out of the offense, and that's James Coley at Georgia. When they hired Todd Monken, it took that offense from being good to national championship level. Good. I thought James Coley just he was the wrong hire for Georgia at that right time. He just didn't get enough out of that offense. So Paul Rhodes also gave up 36 points a game as Arkansas's defensive coordinator in 2017.
Yeah. Oh man, what a list there of just some great. And I'm sure there's people screaming, "How could you forget so and so?" But that was a lot of bad coaches we just referenced. You know what?
Yeah. Do you agree though? Like Bill O'Brien and like Todd Grantham, like they had their coaching warts, I would say, but they were clearly better than some of these guys that when you go one and done, or you only coach 8 games as a coordinator, I think you're on the worst list.
Well, yeah. And to your point, it's funny that you mentioned Peter Sermon. I had forgotten all about him, but anybody that says that Todd Grantham sucks, they did not follow Mississippi State, because they went from Peter Sermon to Todd Grantham. And not that they were like lockdown, but they were literally the worst defense in the SEC. Them and Arkansas were neck and neck, worst defenses. And then in one offseason, Grantham made Mississippi State very respectable. Now, and hell, even at Florida, I mean, they won a lot. Now, it didn't hold up, but and kind of the same deal at Georgia. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he can only do it for a couple of years before the players tune him out. I don't know, but he's not awful. He's a hell of a lot better coach than a lot of everybody we just mentioned. I think I'd put him over.
Yeah, I think also it was Tosh Lapoy would be another one. But, I mean, great recruiter. But if you Pete Golding took over the defensive signals that year.
Break from the show to let you guys know we're brought to you by MyBookie. Head on over to mybookie.ag today. Sign up for an account over at MyBookie with a promo code that SEC THATSEC, and they are willing to match your initial deposit up to 50%, all the way up to $1,000. So you could have up to $1,500 in your account today with MyBookie.ag. The only thing that makes college football better is betting on college football. Fade Cousin Shane's picks. Go with my locks of the week. That's about as I'm 4 for 5 this year. So that I put that on MyBookie. They're willing me to victory week in, week out here on that SEC podcast. Proud to be sponsored by MyBookie. Quick and easy withdrawals when you cash out big and you win big by listening to me and fading Cousin Shane over at MyBookie. Again, that promo code, that SEC. This is the number one way for y'all to help the podcast this football season. We don't ask for much. We give you all this content for free. The least you could do, throw $50, $100 on a MyBookie account, make some money, fading our picks over at mybookie.ag today. Don't forget that promo code, that SEC. Same deal with our friends over at Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports, and they got the college football. That's why we love Prize Picks. Head on over to Prize Picks. If you sign up with a new account with the promo code SEC, they're willing to match your initial deposit up to $100, 100% deposit. So you could have $200 in your account today over at prizepicks.com. Don't forget that promo code SEC. Right, and then another thing I wanted to hit you up with, Stephen, the games, I don't know how many you have. It doesn't really matter, but just the games. I asked you to rank them because we're in the final, several weeks here, and it's kind of sad to even think about. So I'm not trying to look at the negative. I'm trying to look at the big time matchups here in the SEC. It doesn't have to be this week, but it could be. It could be any of the games on the SEC schedule that will kind of factor and determine who wins each division in the SEC. What do you got for us, Stephen?
Number one, I think is pretty easy. I think it's LSU at Alabama. I think not only was it interesting 2 weeks ago, it's gotten more intriguing because of some of the improvement LSU has made defensively. Hard to know too much. I mean, Auburn, Army, what do you read into it? I think what I do read into it is Jaden Daniels and these receivers against Alabama's defense is going to be a dynamic, entertaining, interesting matchup. And I think the game that's going to decide the SEC West. So I think whoever wins on November 4th in this showdown wins the SEC West. And I think that's our number one game, the most important game the rest of the way.
And Ole Miss fans are screaming at you because they're still in it. But they do got that trip to Georgia, which kind of, I think everybody's kind of chalking that up as an automatic loss. It's not, but who knows? That may be on your list here too.
My number 2 game, and that kind of brings me to, I think, the Georgia question is, I want to see how they look this weekend minus Brock Bowers. And this list may look a lot different by Sunday morning if Georgia does not play well. But I think Missouri at Georgia, November 4th, basically circle November 4th as maybe the day the East and West divisions are decided in the SEC. But Missouri having 2 weeks to get ready for this game. You also have Georgia coming off the game against Florida. So an interesting setup. I think Missouri's the second best team in the East. I love, I think it'll be a good matchup of Brady Cook and Luther Burden going down to take on Georgia's defense. And then just interested to see, because of how last year's game went, Missouri's defense, gave Georgia's offense some trouble. I'll be curious to see if they can do that once again. So ask me next week, but I think Missouri at Georgia is our second most important game the rest of the way.
Yeah, that's going to be one hell of a ball game.
Absolutely, man. I mean, you can go down the list of games that I put together here, and you can kind of look at, Georgia at Tennessee, this game, Georgia, Florida. Like I mentioned, I think much of this list could be altered if Georgia doesn't look very good on Saturday against Florida. Odds are small of that, of course.
Let me ask you this, though, real quick, Stephen, on Missouri. What do you think gives them more confidence? The fact that they're playing so well and they're 7-1, or the fact that they went toe-to-toe with Georgia last year in that matchup? What do you think will give them more confidence this season against the Bulldogs?
I would probably say this year's team. I think just because of how, I'm going to say different this team is, but I think offensively, this team is certainly better than they were last year. And we've seen how the last couple of weeks, how active this defensive line can be, and still overall a defense that's one of the best in the SEC to go with a better offense, the confidence level that they should be playing with after they beat Kansas State in a huge game, went toe-to-toe with LSU, went on the road and beat Kentucky. I think it's the way this year's team is playing would give me more confidence than what happened last year. But I think fair to wonder, I think, with kind of both sides on that one.
Mm-hmm. So what's your number 3 game?
Georgia at Tennessee. Got a lot of Georgia on this slate coming up. So, and kind of my reasoning here is, I feel like, to your point, I don't want to forget about Ole Miss here. But Ole Miss, I think, obviously would be an underdog at Georgia. If they couldn't beat Alabama, I'm not sure they're going to go into Athens and win unless Georgia doesn't play well on Saturday without Brock Bowers. But I think Georgia at Tennessee with everything that could be on the line. Like I said, we'll see what happens with Georgia these next couple weeks. Tennessee's got to play Kentucky, still going to have to play Missouri. If those shake out in favor of Tennessee, we could be looking at November 18th, potentially deciding the SEC East title.
And maybe this isn't a fair question because we don't know here on October 23rd as we're talking, but if Tennessee wins out leading up to that Georgia game, I have to imagine that would jump the Missouri-Georgia matchup.
100%.
Yeah.
I think right now, and this probably won't age well, but I like Missouri to finish second in the SEC East, just a spot ahead of Tennessee. But I think the way that Tennessee played at Alabama on Saturday, like we talked about with the first half, the Joe Milton and some of the plays they made through the air, if they can replicate that on Saturday against Kentucky, and Georgia's maybe a little shaky against Florida, Tennessee at home, with how we just saw them beat Texas A&M. Neyland's going to be rocking for this one. So, I think the odds would maybe flip these two if depending on how these two teams go the next couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. All right. So what's the next one on your list?
Tennessee at Missouri, another SEC East showdown. And right now, and I'll go back to kind of what I mentioned just a second ago, but I think this game decides second in the East. I think Georgia is the front runner. It comes down to Missouri and Tennessee at Missouri. And if you think back to last year's game, I think there's a little extra spice with the maybe the late touchdown that Tennessee scored. We'll see if Missouri remembers that one. But either way, I think just intrigue for the potentially second best team in the SEC East, and then that'll be a week after Missouri plays Georgia, so we'll get a good idea of kind of where those two teams size up.
Yeah, speaking of that Tennessee-Missouri matchup from last year, Stephen, I think that's the last time Joe Milton completed a bomb. I mean,
that's right. Yeah,
he was bobbing at everybody. Maybe it was just the receivers. I don't know, but that for some reason is not in the playbook this year.
It wasn't. Or it's not so far. I think that's really been, or I guess I would say like that's what would, if I was a Tennessee fan, give me some confidence is that maybe Saturday's game is a step forward on the path to hitting those big plays that we saw out of this offense last year, because that really is the missing piece right now for Tennessee. I mean, defense is playing well, absent maybe some of the things in the second half against Alabama. We know the run game as well. So if Tennessee can get that going over the next couple weeks when they play Missouri and when they're going to play Georgia and they get Kentucky this week, all of a sudden that could shake things up in favor of Tennessee.
Yeah. Do you have any other games on your list?
Yeah, I've got at number 5, I've got Ole Miss at Georgia. We kind of danced around Ole Miss a little bit here. I don't want to totally forget about them, because if they go on the road and win this game, I guess you're going to have to retire the Lane Whiffen name. He's going to get Kiffin back the rest of the year. But that's the one obstacle I think about when it comes to Ole Miss and the SEC West title. Like if you could sub out Georgia for, South Carolina, we're talking about a different story down the stretch. It's just that I think it's going to be hard to go into Athens and win. So that's why I have it a little bit further down the list. I've got Alabama, Auburn as well. Depending on what happens on Saturday or next Saturday with Alabama, LSU, I just think Iron Bowl implications, an Auburn team with nothing to lose, an Alabama team with everything to gain. Alabama still has to go on the road to Kentucky. So there's some obstacles there still for Alabama. And I'll throw these out there, but I think A&M at LSU, if LSU beats Alabama in 2 weeks and then they need that game, basically could seal the SEC West in some scenarios. Georgia, Florida this weekend, just for rivalry. How does Georgia look? Where does Florida stack up in this too? And of course, don't want to forget about the Egg Bowl and Tennessee and Kentucky. I know I'm throwing a bunch of games out there. Mike, any of those kind of stand out to you?
Yeah, I mean, especially those rivalry games because those are the ones people overlook, and I mean, it's kind of cliche to say, but it's like throw the records out because you just never know what you're going to get. Particularly, I mean, I would think the casual fan is probably rolling their eyes saying Ole Miss versus Mississippi State. Come on, that's a joke, but it's in Starkville, rivalry. I mean, for all the disappointment, and hell, Mississippi State could catch fire. I mean, all it takes is one to start that momentum going. But, I mean, this, let's call it what it is. This has been a disappointing season to date. But if they beat, particularly if it's like 10-1 Ole Miss, my God, they may give Barnett an extension right after it. You know what I mean? Because they're like, you just ruined their perfect season. Maybe a playoff, they'll be so happy. So, yeah, those things. And, you were talking about Ole Miss, Georgia. This yet another reason why, thankfully, they're changing the schedules, because I get it. Tennessee fans, they always bitch, well, we got to play Alabama and Georgia every year, and so does Auburn. But it's nonsensical and we've been doing it for 20 years for some stupid reason, but it just imbalances the schedule so much, East and West. So, They unfortunately Ole Miss gets the short end of the stick, but thankfully this is going to be the last year that we have to do it that way. You know what?
100%. Yeah, I'm on board. Get rid of divisions. Let's go to 9 games and let's rotate through teams and opposing campuses more. I think more SEC games are always better. To go back to what you said too about Ole Miss versus Mississippi State. I mean, what's like this going to be like the third year and fourth year we're going to have like some coaching drama surrounding one of these teams in this game. But not only that, I mean, it will, Mississippi State, depending on how some of these games break out, they may need this game to get bowl eligible. So you have a desperate Mississippi State team searching for bowl eligibility, potential coaching implications in this one too. And also, of course, they won last year, so they can get 2 in a row and sort of salvage their season, I guess, maybe best way to put it, and make Ole Miss a little bit more disappointing of a year, depending on what happens in November. So the Egg Bowl was always super high on my list of rivalry games, even if they both were 0-11. I think it still would be entertaining.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I kind of asked you all those those questions just because this weekend's slate, Stephen, not the greatest slate. I mean, we're never going to turn our nose to an SEC football game, but a couple of these games, I don't know, how entertaining they will be, but that's not the case for all of them, and certainly not Georgia, Florida, in Jacksonville game that you just referenced. It's heck, everybody aside from diehard Florida fans, I would imagine, are just completely overlooking the Gators and their odds. But if they were to win this game, and this is perfect example of what we were just talking about, rivalry games. I mean, there's been many of these games where the one side was sure they're going to win it and they don't do it. Thoughts on Georgia, Florida, both of them coming off a bye. No Brock Bowers. That's obviously the big storyline. But anything else standing out to you with this huge matchup in Jacksonville?
I think the first thing is, we just talked about the top remaining games the rest of the year for the SEC. What if Florida wins this game? Then all of a sudden that game against LSU takes on a little bit more implications later this season. So there's a ton at stake here, I think, for both teams. I think there's more pressure though on Georgia just because they're number 1 or 2 depending on which rankings you look. I do want to throw a little bit of caution because I'm going to look ahead for just a second. Next week we'll get the committee's first playoff rankings, and it would not surprise me if Georgia is not number 1, and it wouldn't surprise me if they're number 3 because of how some of the things have worked out with the Big Ten this year. So I don't want to alarm any Georgia fans at this point. I know I'm looking ahead. You got to be Florida, but don't be surprised. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because by December, it's all going to work itself out. But I think that's kind of to me, the storyline is if you're Georgia, it's a game without Brock Bowers that you have a chance to make your final statement before the first committee's rankings come out. And you're going to do that. And I'm curious to see how they go about doing that. Are they going to use the receivers more? They're getting healthier at running back. The offensive line could be closer to full strength here. There's a lot of reasons to think that Georgia can survive losing Brock Bowers for a couple games. There's no more preseason though for Georgia. This is their toughest stretch the rest of the way. So you can't show up and play in the first half like you had against Auburn because Ole Miss, Missouri, Tennessee, all these games get tougher from here. I think on the other side for Florida, you're kind of playing with house money a little bit. Like no one expects you to win this game. They're a 2-touchdown underdog or so. There is pressure for Billy Napier to have a good showing here, but I also think if you're Florida, there is a little bit of what do we got to lose? You don't want to lose a rivalry game 49-0, but I think you can play loose. All the pressure's on Georgia. They're the higher ranked team. And I think if you're Florida, you come off of that win over South Carolina with probably a little bit more confidence, a little bit more momentum going into the bye week, a chance to rest up and go play Georgia. So I'm curious to see how Florida plays with nothing to lose, and Georgia without Brock Bowers. How are they adjusting in the first game after losing him?
And what style of game do you think would favor a potential upset for the Gators? Would it be a low-scoring game with it Georgia not having Brock Bowers, or would it be a high-scoring game with you get your running game going, you got Graham Mertz red hot. Ricky Pershaw unguardable. Which way would you lean on that?
It's a tough question because it's almost like you could probably make a case for either one. In a high scoring game where things are kind of crazy, maybe you get a play like you did against South Carolina where the ball goes through the receiver's hands and the next guy catches it. I think if I was Florida, though, I would probably prefer a lower scoring game, but I could be convinced. High school. What do you think? You think low scoring's probably better?
No, I gotta be honest with you. No, I think you have to. I think you have to get in a shootout, and you have to hope that Carson Beck makes a critical mistake without Bowers to lean on. I think that's the path, but that's very easy for me to sit here and say because I don't think you can go up and down the field on Georgia's defense. So, but sometimes there's been many a game, Stephen, where we go into a game and we're like, my God, this defense, can it be scored on? And then they can't stop them. You know what I mean? Or vice versa. This offense, this is LSU 2019, and then they muster 14 points. You know what I mean? So sometimes these big games kind of reveal true character, but I think you have to beat Georgia by a shootout, and that's much easier said than done, I realize, but I think that's the method to doing it.
In rivalry games, I guess anything could happen too. To your point, we kind of touched on some of the crazy things that could happen and how teams sort of play above their potential or how they've played this year because of it's a rivalry game. I guess the reason why I would say low scoring is I think to the Auburn game. It was lower scoring. Georgia kind of made some mistakes that allowed Auburn to hang around early. That would be really my only reasoning, but I do think if you're Florida with the way the offense has been playing, especially, I know South Carolina's had a lot of issues defensively, but if you can get Graham Mertz hot and you can move the ball through the air, ETN and Montrell Johnson are attacking sort of the edges like Auburn did in the run game, maybe we are getting a higher scoring game than we think here. But I go back to the Auburn game and I go back to the Missouri game is lower scoring. And also in my mind, I'm thinking college football playoff, CJ Stroud, Ohio State, they tried to move the ball up and down through the air and they had a lot of success too. So I guess maybe there could, either way, I guess there could be some paths there for Florida.
And is there any area of this football game that you think Florida has a clear advantage, in position group or coaching or anything at all?
It's hard to find one at this point. I think
it's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, unless you're talking about sleep and getting a good night of rest. Showing us all the importance of a good night of rest, I guess. No, I'm kidding. But I think if you're Florida, I think the reasons to be optimism. If you're looking for a path for an upset, I think offensive line that's had 2 weeks to get healthy. Your starting center's been banged up. You get maybe everybody back at full strength. Georgia doesn't have a Jalen Carter right now on the in the middle of the defense. They've got a good defensive front, obviously, but no guy that's probably going to be first team All-American at the end of the year. You've got a quarterback who's playing pretty well in Graham Mertz. He's been efficient. He's not making mistakes. He's coming off, I think, maybe his best game at Florida. So I think Florida is trending up to some extent, and maybe that's but combine that with the fact you have nothing to lose, where you're an underdog by 2 touchdowns, you can just go out there and empty the bag of trick plays or whatever it is that Billy Napier has in store for Georgia.
All right, how about Tennessee at Kentucky? You used to play for the coolest trophy in college football, the beer barrel. Now it's down to a bourbon bet that we've made here on this show. But thoughts on Tennessee coming off a tough loss? Kentucky coming off multiple tough losses, but they've had 2 weeks to prepare. This is an opportunity for both these teams to, I don't want to say salvage the season. I think that's fair for Kentucky, but Tennessee, they need this one too if they're going to have a really good year. You can't be losing these games. What's your thoughts on this matchup?
I think the first thing that jumps out to me is I don't love the timing for Tennessee. It's like their second high-profile showdown. You think about the A&M game at home, the road game against Alabama last week. Kentucky's coming off the bye week too. I think the timing favors Kentucky in this one. You look at the series, I mean, it's such a one-sided series. Tennessee's won 9 out of the last 11. The last 3 in Lexington were decided by one score. So I think we could be in for probably an entertaining game on Saturday. The other thing that stands out here too is it feels like these two teams are sort of maybe mirror images of each other. They have transfer quarterbacks, so you could argue have underachieved, led by the rushing attack, talented receiving cores that have been inconsistent, maybe underachieving at times. Defensively, they're strong up front. Some question marks in the secondary, I think, for both. It's kind of a weird setup here that I think on paper, this matchup and timing and home field favors Kentucky. I think this is probably going to, and I know it's simple to say this, is Devin Leary going to play better than he did, in the SEC play so far, or does Joe Milton build off what we saw him do in the first half against Alabama?
Yeah, and I don't know if this is fair or not, Steven, because this is the Tennessee game, so I'm pretty sure the Kentucky fans will show up, but you never know. I mean, obviously, if this was 3 weeks ago, this would have been one hell of an environment, but after both the losses they've had, I'm curious to know how tough an environment this really will be for Tennessee to walk into. And again, I realize night game on the road. I'm not saying it's going to be a cakewalk, but I just think some of that air's out of that balloon, so to speak. What's your thoughts on that?
So you're saying SEC Mike is saying that Tennessee is going to take over Kroger Field on Saturday night. That's what I'm hearing. Is that right?
It's discount aisle Kroger, down there. I don't know. I mean, these fans were all fired up about it, but I haven't heard a peep from them basically since the Missouri game.
Man, if I was a Kentucky fan, I'd be fired up for this one. I mean, you get a chance to beat Tennessee. Tennessee's gettable at your place. Kentucky's coming off the off week with a chance to maybe figure out or hit the reset button offensively in the passing game to whatever is ailing Devin Leary from missed passes, whether people aren't on the same page. You and Shane have talked about this. Like, I feel good about the game plans that Liam Cohen is putting together every week, but it's just not clicking in the passing game. So I think if I was a Kentucky fan, I'd be fired up regardless of what's happened in the last 2 weeks. You're getting Tennessee at your place and you get a chance to kind of spoil their season. I would be there at Kroger Field if I was a Wildcat fan.
If this tough to answer probably, Stephen, but which team do you think has a better performance on the ground going up against each other's defenses here on Saturday night?
And that's like the $1 million question here, because as I'm trying to project this game, it feels like you almost think both of these teams are good at running the ball and both these teams are pretty good at stopping it. But you also kind of feel like Ray Davis and the Tennessee backs they're probably going to get some yards in this game. So, man, I hate to give you a bad answer, but it really feels like a coin flip here. I will say if Kentucky runs the ball like they did against Florida a couple weeks ago, they're going to win this game. So I think for Tennessee, it's all about stopping Ray Davis and making Devin Leary beat you.
Yeah. All right. How about South Carolina at A&M, Stephen? South Carolina won last year. It was their first win over A&M as an SEC opponent. Can they make it two in a row and send Jimbo down the river?
Man, this is going to be tough for South Carolina to go. If this was at Williams-Brice at night, like it was last year, I could talk myself into another upset of A&M. I think it's just going to be so tough, though, for South Carolina's offensive line with the struggles it had against Missouri to be able to contain Texas A&M. If they can, we've seen a couple weeks ago, Alabama had success through the air against this Texas A&M secondary. I think Spencer Rattler, provided that he has enough healthy weapons, I think could make some plays through the air. That's the path to me for an upset for South Carolina. It's Spencer Rattler having a big game, maybe a play or two on special teams. That would be the upset path. I think A&M's defensive line, though, coming off the off week, I think A&M's probably just going to be too much at home.
Mm-hmm. How about Mississippi State Auburn, Stephen? Does either team score 14 points?
speaking of setting offensive football back, this is another 17-10, 13-10 kind of game. What maybe we could throw it back to the 3-2 game too. So a lot of possibilities between two teams that are averaging about 17 points a game offensively right now in SEC play. I think the storyline for me in this one is just simply it's important for both teams in terms of getting to 6 wins. It's a winnable game for both sides of it. So interested to see the quarterbacks here too, because you have Mike Wright, who started last week, did exactly what Mississippi State needed. Does Will Rogers come back this week? And if you're Auburn, like the Peyton Thorne, Robbie Ashford combo, however, can you get anything through the air? Because the plays we've seen Mississippi State's secondary outside of the game against Arkansas last week, they can give up some yards. And if you can get something here for Auburn at home, even in a series that's 5-5 in the last 10, this is a pretty favorable spot for Auburn as it tries to get bowl eligible.
And then last one, Stephen, Vanderbilt at Ole Miss. You're sitting here wondering, can Ole Miss beat Georgia and Athens? I'm wondering if they can beat Vanderbilt at home and get that Lane Whiffen name back. Any shot Vanderbilt pulls the epic upset.
Well, I think if you wanted to make a case for them to, I think they're desperate. They haven't won a game in SEC play this year. And also they played, from the start of the season up until last week. I think they kind of ran out of steam. They're certainly a young team. I think proven depth is a question mark. So I think the off week, getting a chance to hit the reset button is probably a good thing for this team. And you also have the type of playmakers at receiver, and either if it's Ken Seals or AJ Swan, there probably are some plays to be made against Ole Miss's secondary. So I think for Ole Miss, they'll have to fight the desperate team looking to get a victory. I think if you're Ole Miss, you look at it as, this is our playoff at this point. Like, we have to win every game the rest of the way to get to the SEC championship game, knowing that they're probably not going to look at the Georgia game like we do, but they can't afford to slip up here, especially in this spot where they're heavily favored and at home. So I think Ole Miss takes care of business, but I think they're going to get a very feisty Vanderbilt team off the bye week.
And I'm going to put you on the spot because last week you told me I could do this now. So and we don't need exact predictions or anything like that. Any of the games you're not ready to call or anything like that. But any of these that you're particularly feeling strong about that you think will win this weekend in the SEC?
Feel pretty good about Ole Miss winning. Now watch this not age well. I'll take Ole Miss. Maybe I should wait I should see you guys make your picks so I know where the Grim Reaper is going to be this Saturday in the SEC. But no, I'm going to take Ole Miss. I'm going to take Auburn at home. Not a ton of confidence in that one. That might be my Morristown Honda pick of the week right there. To Auburn to beat Mississippi State. Pretty confident Georgia and A&M, and honestly have no idea about Tennessee and Kentucky. I probably would lean Tennessee close, but that's probably the one that I feel least confident in going into this week.
Your cousin Shane, he's just clutching that bourbon this week because he's afraid to send it off. But hey, we went a little bit long, so I do appreciate you, Stephen. Anything else while we have you here before any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. We are at the point of the season where the playoff rankings come out, and this is sort of my annual PSA is, let's try not to get our blood pressure up too much about the rankings because they are going to change so much from Halloween until December, whatever it is that the final ones come out. And so the reason why I brought up Georgia is it wouldn't be surprising to me to see them at 2 or 3, which could be a good thing for Kirby Smart. He could use it as the disrespect card the rest of the year. But it is that time of the year where the playoff rankings come out, and there's still a lot to play for. Obviously, for Georgia, if Alabama wins out, there's still a lot of interesting scenarios. So prepare yourself for the committee's playoff rankings on Halloween night.
And last thing, Stephen, before you go, can you tell the audience, in case they've maybe this is their first time catching you, where can they follow you and where can they find your work online?
Absolutely. So you can read all my work at athlonsports.com. You can check us out also on the Cover 2 podcast. We come out every Wednesday. We preview everything across the country. So if you want to talk about Jim Harbaugh sign stealing up at Michigan or what's going on in the Pac-12, we got you covered. It's the Cover 2 podcast by Athlon Sports. And you can follow me on Twitter at Athlon Steven. And I'm also on YouTube at all CFB 365.
All right, Stephen. Thank you so much, and can't wait to catch up next weekend to preview what is going to be a historic week of games here in the SEC on what is it, November 4th, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Looking forward to it. It's going to be the two showdowns in the East and West. It should be a big Saturday of action. I look forward to catching up with you next week.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'll cut it right there. All right, so just we'll say thanks again, Stephen, for joining the show. Great conversation. Hope you guys appreciated that as much as I did. Cousin Shane be back on the next episode, but we got some things cooking for the next episode, so stay tuned for that. But I do appreciate each and every one of you for hanging out, and we'll catch you on the next one.